Friday. Another day, another dollar. We got some snow last night. I got a good amount of snow last night. Still snowing.
Russian President Vladimir Putin delivering his State of the Nation address to both houses of parliament. He says the West is to blame for not only igniting the war in Ukraine, but for sustaining it as well.
The West uses Ukraine as a ram against Russia. The more long-range weapons arrive in Ukraine from the West, the more we'll have to push the threat from our borders. That's natural.
And later today, U.S. President Joe Biden will be offering a response to Putin. Biden is in Poland the day after meeting with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky in Kyiv. Alex Panetta has more.
He's hoping to deliver one message, and he wants it to be heard in different places, in Moscow, Beijing, in Europe, and back home in the U.S. And that message in one word is unity, that Ukraine's allies are united, and they're not going to back down. He just previewed the message in Ukraine itself. Biden arrived in Warsaw last night after a surprise trip to Kiev. He recalled how, 1 year ago, he was on the phone with President Zelensky. There were explosions in the background. The leaders didn't know when or if they'd ever speak again.
1 year later, Kyiv stands, and Ukraine stands, democracy stands, the Americans stand with you, and the world stands with you.
That message of allied unity is intended for different audiences, and not just Moscow and Europe. He's also telling Beijing, don't get involved. The U.S. says China is seriously considering providing weapons to Russia, which potentially broadens the war. Alex Panetta, CBC News, Washington.
Meanwhile, Ukraine is asking Canada for help in repairing its damaged railway system. Ukrainian officials say at least 20% of the country's rail lines have been destroyed, and they're looking to Canada for parts and expertise in establishing a rebuilding program. The country's rail system, along with its electricity grid, have been a key target in recent weeks in Russia's ongoing bombing campaign. Rescue crews are again searching for survivors after yet another earthquake in Turkey. That's a scene in Hatay City where a 6.4 magnitude tremor brought down dozens of buildings, already weakened by earthquakes earlier this month. This latest quake was near the border with Syria, which is the same region that was devastated on February 6th. Those earthquakes claimed at least 45,000 lives, and that left more than 1 million people homeless. And that is the world this hour. You can listen to us live on your mobile device using the CBC Listen app or anytime on voice-activated devices like Amazon Echo or Google Home. For CBC News, I'm Joe Cummings.
Now, the weather. Most of the region will have snow today, anywhere from 2 to 10 centimeters. Snow will end this morning for some communities if it hasn't already, but for Sudbury, Espanola, Killarney, Manitoulin Island, and Gilgama, Kapuskasing at Hearst as well, snow ending this afternoon. And for Elliott Lake and the North Shore, snow ending near noon. The far north will be sunny but cold. An extreme cold warning is in place. Highs today minus 15 degrees to 0, but in the far north minus 24 to minus 18 degrees. Feeling colder with the wind chill, especially this morning.
Good morning, I'm Matt Galloway, and you're listening to The Current. come, remembering the life and work of the Canadian arts and broadcasting visionary Peter Herndorf. Plus, Canadian historian Arthur Milnes calls Jimmy Carter a hero of his. Joins us to talk about the president's legacy and what it's like to put up a former president for a night. But first, the invocation of the Emergencies Act has been deemed appropriate, but the political fallout continues.
I have concluded that when the decision was made to invoke the Act on February 14th, 2022, Cabinet had reasonable grounds to believe that there existed a national emergency arising from threats to the security of Canada that necessitated the taking of special temporary measures.
On Friday, Justice Paul Rouleau released his final report on the government's use of the Emergencies Act to deal with protesters in downtown Ottawa last winter. Not everyone agrees with his conclusion. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association says it believes the government did not meet the legal threshold to invoke the Act. Kara Zwiebel is director of the Fundamental Freedoms Program for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. She also presented to Justice Rouleau and the Public Order Emergency Commission. Kara, good morning.
Good morning.
You and I spoke about this over the course of this inquiry. Just remind us why you believe the government did not meet that threshold to invoke the Emergencies Act.
So, I mean, it's focused primarily on this meaning of that phrase, threats to the security of Canada, and whether that threshold was met. The Emergencies Act defines that term by referencing the CSIS Act, and we know from evidence at the Commission that CSIS didn't believe that there was a threat that met that definition. And the government's justification for why they came to a different conclusion, and we agree that the government is entitled to come to a different conclusion, but the reason why they came to that, the reasons are very, very diffuse and I would say speculative. There's a lot about what might happen, a concern that this might happen or that might happen, that someone might use the sort of chaos created by the protests to capitalize on that and engage in some sort of violent activity. But there's really nothing specific and no sort of actionable intelligence that supported that conclusion. And the government really, at the time that the emergency was invoked, they focused a lot on economic concerns and I think that played a much more significant role than it should have, and than the legislation really contemplates.
In his report, Justice Rouleau said, "I do not accept the organizers' descriptions of the protests as lawful, calm, peaceful, or something resembling a celebration. The bigger picture reveals that the situation in Ottawa was unsafe and chaotic, disregard for both law and well-being of the people of Ottawa." Do you believe those protests constituted a national emergency?
152.
I don't because again, I think that to the extent that a national emergency is something that requires new powers that police or lawmakers, don't already have, I don't think that's the case. I think police are, they are equipped. They do have the legal tools to deal with highly disruptive, even violent protests. In this case, I think there's a lot of evidence, and the commissioner does say this, about very poor coordination, very, a real inability to sort of work together and address the situation. But a lot of the police witnesses that testified, they didn't point to a lack of legal tools. They pointed to a lack of resources. They needed to get enough people in Ottawa to execute a plan. But it wasn't that the law is insufficient to deal with these things.
These are extraordinary powers, and they come with great consideration in terms of their invocation. What role do you think the government has in balancing the rights and the freedoms of protesters with the rights and the freedoms of the people that Justice Rouleau was describing, who felt as though their well-being was being disrupted, their lives were being disrupted, they couldn't get to work, they couldn't sleep, businesses lost money, etc.?
I think that, that's certainly the job of government, and it's a difficult one. I think that, at the time that the protests were happening, there was a real recognition that police weren't adequately protecting the population that was being affected by these protests. And I think also at the commission, we unfortunately heard that some of the protesters didn't much care that their, political protest activities,
Maybe
which
there's
were
an
directed
accident.
at the government, were affecting people that had nothing to do, with the issues that they were protesting.
Do we have a clearer sense then, after this report, about what that line is between lawful and unlawful protest for people who want to express dissent?
Yes and no. I think if you look at the report, and I think this is a function of how our Charter of Rights works. It guarantees rights and freedoms, but it also says they're subject to reasonable limits. And defining that reasonable limits line is always going to be a context and fact-specific exercise, and that's what the commissioner says. He says that some of these activities crossed over the line. They wouldn't always cross over the line necessarily. It's not that highly disruptive protests or even blocking roadways will necessarily always cross over the line into sort of unprotected assembly activities. It is a very context-specific exercise, and so it's. I think while if you read the report, there is some guidance and some helpful language in there. Ultimately, any given situation has to be assessed on its own facts and context.
Language is interesting because Justice Rouleau also called out the Prime Minister for the language that he used in describing the protesters, in describing them as a fringe minority. Take a listen to how Justin Trudeau responded to that.
I wish I had said that differently. The fact is, there is a very small number of people in this country who deliberately spread misinformation and disinformation that led to Canadians' deaths, that led to excessive hardship in people who believed them. I continue to be very, very firm against those individuals. But that is a small subset of people who were just hurting and worried and wanting to be heard. And as much as I tried to emphasize throughout the time that, of course, we're always going to stand up for freedom of speech and freedom to protest peacefully, I wish I hadn't said something that was able to be spread larger. If I had chosen my words a bit careful, been more specific, I think things might have been a bit easier.
Those are very different words than he used a year ago. What impact do you think the Prime Minister's language had at the time?
I think it has a significant impact, first of all on sort of hardening the resolve of some of the protesters, and I think also on conveying to the rest of the country that this was something other than a peaceful.
Well, everyone, have a good day. Be safe. If you're in an area that's storming, make sure you have everything you need. Be careful.